Craig Monson was one of those names that feel way too big to have been forgotten. A massive bodybuilder, insanely strong, who emerged during what's known as the Golden Era, but for a bunch of reasons, he ended up slipping completely off the mainstream radar. While some athletes became global icons, Craig turned into almost an urban legend, known mainly by the people who actually lived through that time. What made Craig so special was the fact that he was way ahead of his time. Long before the so-called mass monster era, he was already showing a physique that seemed impossible by the standards of the day. He wasn't just big. He was thick, dense, carved like every muscle had been sculpted by hand, combining extreme size with a level of symmetry that was incredibly rare. To put that into perspective, Monson stepped on stage weighing around 122 kilos, roughly 270 to 272 pounds. Today, that still turns heads, but back in the 1970s and 1980s, it was completely unreal. At that time, a bodybuilder weighing about 104 kilos, around 230 pounds, was already considered gigantic. Craig was nearly 20 kilos, about 40 pounds, heavier than that, while still keeping definition and strong stage presence. To really understand Craig Monson's impact, you have to rewind and look at the world he came up in. The 60s, 70s, and 80s became known as the golden era of bodybuilding, a near-mythical period marked by legendary gyms, iconic physiques, and a very clear philosophy about what it meant to be a great athlete. This was the era when names like Arnold Schwarzenegger, Frank Zane, Sergio Oliva, Lee Haney, and Larry Scott ruled the stages and shaped how the sport was imagined. Each one represented a different ideal, but they all shared the same core traits: charisma, proportion, and aesthetics. Back then, bodybuilding wasn't a wild race toward extreme size. The main focus was symmetry, body lines, a tight waist, muscle separation, and, above all, stage presence. An athlete had to impress not just with volume, but with harmony and the way they carried themselves in front of the crowd and the judges. Now that you understand the era we're talking about, let's focus on the story of the monster himself. Craig Monson was born in the early 1950s and grew up in south-central Los Angeles, an environment shaped by tough social conditions and very limited opportunities. Even so, from a very young age, Craig showed something unusual for a kid from that background: an almost obsessive curiosity about the human body, physical strength, and muscle development. While other kids were out playing in the streets, Craig was drawn to dumbbells, barbells, and anything that could be used as weight. By just 12 years old, he was already training consistently, without coaching, without a real gym, and without any close role models. It was all instinctive, driven more by curiosity and a desire to get strong than by any competitive dream at that point. Between the ages of 14 and 15, his body started changing so dramatically that people couldn't help but notice. A full chest, thick arms, and a frame that seemed to be evolving at an unnatural pace. That's when he earned the nickname, the missing link, as if he were some kind of human caught between the average person and something far more powerful and primitive. That transformation wasn't just about physical training. It was fueled by an almost artistic fascination with bodybuilding. Craig spent hours flipping through magazines like Iron Man, studying every physique, every pose, every tiny detail. Training with weights in the 60s and 70s wasn't common at all, and it definitely wasn't socially accepted. A lot of people saw lifting weights as weird, dangerous, or even a sign that something was mentally off. None of that shook Craig Monson. While the world said it made no sense, he stayed locked in, training every single day with a level of discipline that already looked like that of a professional athlete. Without access to real gyms, Craig did what very few people would have had the guts or creativity to do. In his backyard, he built his own equipment using milk crates, wooden boards, and concrete. Everything was improvised, heavy, raw, and exactly the way he liked it. During this process, family support was crucial, especially from his mother. When she saw just how committed her son was, she made a simple but life-changing decision. She bought him his first real set of weights, made of cement and coated in plastic. That might not sound like much today, but back then, it meant believing in a kid's dream when almost no one else did. Over time, Craig wasn't training alone anymore. He started teaching his brothers, friends, and kids from the neighborhood how to lift real weight. It wasn't just about physical training. It was about discipline, routine, and focus. The backyard became a gathering spot where strength was built together, away from the streets and the problems surrounding the neighborhood, at least for a while. Growing up in South Central Los Angeles in the 1960s meant facing tough choices every single day. For Craig Monson, the streets were just as present as the weights in his backyard. Still very young, he ended up deeply involved in the local gang culture, not as a background figure, but as someone who quickly rose into a leadership role. Craig became the leader of a gang known as the Avenues, a group both feared and respected on the east side of South Central. In that world, leadership didn't come from speeches. It came from presence, strength, and reputation. Monson had all of that. His sheer size and commanding posture earned instant respect, something that later translated just as strongly inside the gyms. The influence of the Avenues was so significant that the group even played an indirect role in the early formation of one of the most infamous gangs in U.S. history, the Crips. That historical connection shows just how deeply Craig was embedded in a critical moment of American urban culture, long before his name was ever associated with bodybuilding. During this phase, Monson's life was marked by constant run-ins with the law. Arrests became a regular part of his teenage years and early adulthood, creating a cycle that was hard to escape. And yet, even in the middle of that chaos, something unusual stood firm. The training never stopped. Weightlifting remained the one constant in an otherwise out-of-control life. Craig Monson's first major reality check came while he was still very young, when a friend took him to Venice Beach in California. That's where Muscle Beach was located, the place already considered the true birthplace of modern bodybuilding. For Craig, this wasn't just a casual trip. It was a turning point. What he saw there was unlike anything he had ever experienced up close. Massive physiques, dominant presence, and an atmosphere that felt almost mythical. Watching athletes train there, especially seeing names like Arnold Schwarzenegger in person, left a deep impression. In that moment, Craig realized bodybuilding could go far beyond the limits of his backyard. But that first contact wasn't easy. When he tried to enter the famous training area known as the Pit, Craig faced open racial discrimination. Even with money in hand, he was denied entry simply because he was black. For many people, that would have been the end of the road. For Monson, it was just another obstacle. Instead of backing down, Craig did what he'd always done. He pushed forward. He and his friends literally jumped the fence and started training anyway. This happened more than once. Eventually, worn down by the situation, the people in charge gave in and officially allowed him inside. Craig had earned his place through pure persistence. It was there, among heavy iron, suspicious stares, and legendary physiques, that the dream stopped being abstract. Muscle Beach showed Craig Monson that competing at the highest level was actually possible. Then, in 1970, just as things seemed to be lining up for a positive turn, Craig Monson's life took a shocking and unexpected direction. At around 20 years old, he found himself in the middle of an extreme situation after confronting an armed intruder inside his family's home. In a matter of seconds, an ordinary night turned into a moment that would define his life forever. The confrontation was fast, chaotic, and driven purely by survival instinct. There was a struggle, fear, and intense tension. The intruder ended up dying during the altercation, and Craig believed he was acting in self-defense, protecting his own life and his home. But what seemed like a clear case of self-defense quickly turned into a long, heavy legal battle. Despite his version of events, the court ruled that excessive force had been used. Craig Monson was convicted of manslaughter, a decision that completely altered the course of his life. From a young, promising bodybuilder, he suddenly carried the weight of a criminal conviction, one that would pull him away from the world for years to come. In total, Craig served about 4.5 years in prison, including time at one of the harshest and most feared institutions in the United States, San Quentin. There, far from the stage lights, the gyms, and his freedom, he had more than enough time to reflect on his choices, the consequences, and what kind of future he wanted. For most people, prison represents stagnation, loss, wasted time, and the end of expectations. For Craig, paradoxically, that hostile environment became just another battlefield to conquer. Even behind bars, he made a clear decision. He would not allow his body, or his mind, to weaken. With no gyms, no proper equipment, and zero comfort, Craig used whatever he could to train. Bodyweight movements, improvised objects, manual resistance, anything worked. The goal was simple and non-negotiable: maintain strength, muscle mass, and discipline, even in one of the toughest environments imaginable. While many inmates were swallowed by the destructive routine of prison life, Monson turned his days into cycles of training and focus. Exercise became a psychological anchor, something that kept his identity alive. He wasn't just an inmate. He still saw himself as a bodybuilder in the making. Over those years behind bars, Craig didn't just preserve his physique. He sharpened his determination. Every improvised rep fed a quiet conviction. When he got out, he'd return more prepared, stronger, and hungrier than ever to compete at a high level. When he finally walked free, Craig Monson didn't just carry the weight of his past. He stepped out with a clear mission in mind: to become an elite bodybuilder, no matter the cost. If Craig's size alone was impressive, his strength seemed completely outside normal human logic. At a time when very few athletes were even close to these numbers, Craig made the impossible look routine. His bench press, for example, reached around 227 kilos, about 500 pounds, for 10 reps, a level of strength that would still put an athlete in a different league even today. And that was just the start. On his heaviest days, Monson loaded over 266 kilos, around 585 pounds, onto the bar and treated it as a personal challenge. What's most terrifying is that these weren't occasional ego lifts. This was real training. What truly shocked anyone watching was how he warmed up. Craig would start his bench sessions with roughly 180 kilos, about 400 pounds, cranking out long, high-rep sets. What would be a lifetime PR for most lifters was just his opening act. That showed not just raw power, but insane endurance and control. When it came to triceps work, things got even more surreal. Monson performed lying triceps extensions with about 102 kilos, roughly 225 pounds, handling the bar like it was nothing. On the leg press, he easily pushed past 590 kilos, while over 1,300 pounds, stacking plates and sometimes even people on the machine, leaving everyone around him in disbelief. All of that resulted in arms measuring close to 58 centimeters, around 23 inches, built through brutal, loud, almost intimidating training sessions. Grunts, shouts, and a dominant presence made it impossible for anyone in the gym to ignore Craig Monson. For a large part of his early career, Craig Monson competed completely natural. At a time when many athletes were still training without advanced chemical aids, he already stood out for his size and strength, proving that his genetics and work ethic were far above average. Even without steroids, Craig hit staggering numbers. In his natural off-season, he reached around 109 kilos, about 240 pounds, while maintaining dense muscle, insane strength, and a physical presence that turned heads wherever he went. By the standards of that era, that alone placed Monson in an extremely rare category. The transition into steroid use didn't happen suddenly or as a deliberate plan. At first, Craig was indirectly exposed to substances that were presented to him as supplements or vitamins. Only later did he realize what was actually going on, and from that point on, he chose to seek medical supervision to regulate their use, trying to maintain some level of control over the impact on his body. With the controlled introduction of those substances, Monson's physique jumped to a whole new level. His body weight started climbing fast, breaking limits that had seemed completely unreachable before. That's when he crossed the 136 kilo mark, over 300 pounds, which was absolutely surreal for a bodybuilder from the golden era. The real turning point in Craig Monson's career came when he caught the attention of Paco Arce, a European sponsor who immediately saw something the sport itself didn't quite know how to deal with yet. Paco invited Craig to compete at the Mr. World in Switzerland, an international stage that would change everything. The moment Craig stepped on stage, the impact was instant. He showed up weighing around 122 kilos, roughly 272 pounds, a number that was completely out of bounds for that level of competition. To put the visual shock into perspective, Craig was about 42 pounds, nearly 19 kilos, heavier than any other athlete in the lineup. There was simply no comparison. The crowd's reaction was immediate. As soon as Craig started posing, the entire atmosphere shifted. The audience went wild, chanting his name, erupting at every movement, making it clear they were witnessing something they had never seen before. It wasn't just size. It was presence, density, and total control of the stage. And then came the shock. When the judges announced the results, Monson was placed only 5th. The decision hit the venue like a bomb. The crowd exploded in protest, stomping, shouting, and disrupting the event entirely. The pressure became so intense that the organizers had no choice. In the face of the public backlash, Craig Monson was officially recognized as the People's Champion, receiving the title the audience had already given him from the very first minute. After the impact he made at Mr. World, Craig received an invitation that fully confirmed his transformation into an international phenomenon. He was invited to compete at the Night of the Crystal, a major event in the United Kingdom, surrounded by massive hype, media attention, and a crowd hungry for a spectacle. From the very first second, Craig made it clear this wouldn't be just another appearance. As he walked on stage to the 10 Commandments, the entire vibe changed. The epic soundtrack, combined with his colossal size, created an almost cinematic moment, like the arrival of a mythological figure, not just a bodybuilder. His routine was intense, theatrical, and intimidating. Every pose radiated power, control, and dominance. Craig wasn't just showing muscles, he was owning the stage. The crowd reacted with screams, applause, and moments of complete silence between movements, totally hypnotized by what they were watching. But that event marked something even more important. Guided by experienced friends, Craig learned that the stage wasn't just a place to impose dominance, it was also a place to connect. He began smiling, interacting with the crowd, and showing genuine enjoyment up there. That simple shift turned the intimidating giant into a true showman. From that night on, Craig Monson stopped being just an impressive athlete and became an international bodybuilding celebrity. With global success locked in, Craig fully embraced the lifestyle that defined the 1980s. Limousines, exclusive parties, Hollywood nights, and constant access to the entertainment elite became part of his everyday life. Wherever Craig went, he stood out. Everyone wanted to be close to the giant who seemed larger than life itself. But fame came with a darker side. The 1980s were also marked by an explosion in drug use, especially cocaine, which was everywhere in celebrity circles. Immersed in that environment, Craig ended up getting involved with it, at first socially, but it quickly spiraled out of control. The impact was devastating. Little by little, bodybuilding stopped being the priority. Training became inconsistent, focus disappeared, and without even realizing it, Craig drifted completely away from the sport. In total, he spent about 6 years away from the stage and the gym, something unthinkable for someone who had always lived through his body. That distance wasn't just physical, it was emotional. The fall came with deep depression. The man who had once been cheered by massive crowds now faced emptiness, a loss of identity, and the heavy weight of the choices made at the peak of fame. After years trapped in addiction and completely disconnected from the sport, Craig finally hit a breaking point. He realized that if he didn't make a radical change, he would lose everything for good. That's when he made the hardest decision of his life, to seek professional help and face the problem head-on, going through intensive treatment to overcome his dependency. Rehab wasn't easy, but it marked the beginning of a new chapter. Free from drugs and with a clearer mind, Craig turned his attention back to what had always been his foundation, training. At 46 years old, an age when most athletes have been retired for decades, he decided to return to the gym, not to prove anything to anyone else, but to rebuild himself. And that's when the shock happened. Even after years away from the weights, Craig made history once again. He loaded 315 pounds, about 143 kilos, on the bench press and cranked out 50 reps, not just once, but multiple times. For anyone watching, it looked unreal. For him, it was proof that his strength had never truly disappeared. Over time, Craig regained much of the muscle mass, density, and strength that defined his prime. His body responded in an almost shocking way, as if it had simply been waiting for the chance to come back. Later on, looking to push his results even further, he experimented with growth hormone. The gains were noticeable, but the side effects soon became obvious and alarming. That was enough for Craig to walk away from it. Older and wiser, he understood that it wasn't worth sacrificing his health again. In 2016, just when life seemed to be back in balance, Craig faced yet another unexpected challenge. He had to undergo gallbladder surgery, a common procedure, but one that hit his body hard. Recovery was tough and came with a rapid, visible loss of muscle mass. For someone who built his entire identity around strength and physical presence, watching his body shrink wasn't easy. For months, Craig couldn't train the way he wanted, which took a toll not just physically, but mentally as well. Still, he approached this phase with the same mindset that had always defined him: patience, discipline, and resilience. Once he was medically cleared, his return was cautious. No extreme weights, no insane workouts. Craig focused on lighter loads, respecting his limits and progressing in a controlled, smart way. Today, far from crowded gyms and competitive stages, Craig maintains his shape with simple at-home exercises, like push-ups and bodyweight movements. For a period of time, he also worked at a local club called Dublin's, living a quiet life, far removed from the fame that once surrounded him on all sides. Craig Monson chose silence after a life defined by extremes. He lives outside the spotlight, not chasing recognition or applause. When you look at Craig Monson's entire journey, it becomes clear that he wasn't just another golden-era bodybuilder. Craig represents an incredibly rare combination of extreme strength, massive size, and solid aesthetics, something very few athletes ever managed to put together, especially in a time that didn't favor physiques that big. At the same time, his legacy is full of contrast. For many fans, Craig is almost a mythical figure, someone who was ahead of his time and never received recognition proportional to what he built. Craig Monson's story isn't just about muscles, strength, or titles. It's about highs and lows, hard choices, deep falls, and unlikely comebacks. It's proof that some legends aren't built only on stage, but in the way someone faces life when everything seems to be falling apart. And maybe that's exactly why this story hits so hard. Now I want to hear from you. Was Craig Monson an underrated talent of the golden era, a giant ahead of his time, or a reminder of how context and personal choices can completely change a destiny? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective is part of this conversation. And if this video brought you real value, make sure to hit that like button right now.